it. International question! International question! International question! Anonymous, New York.
Ooh.
Do you like that like kind of thrill I added to Anonymous?
Yes, I liked
made it intriguing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anonymous says, "Hello, Gabby and Allison. I love your podcast and admire the way the two of you have really grown into yourselves in recent years. My boyfriend and I have been together for 4 years. We have a loving, committed relationship and pride ourselves on how openly we communicate. Unfortunately, the pandemic has served as an eye-opener for some fundamental differences in our upbringings and perspectives. Although my boyfriend is very cautious about COVID, takes masking seriously, works from home, and avoids eating out or participating in riskier activities, he remains unvaccinated, as does all of his nuclear family. I am 25 with a background in biology, working in healthcare, and personally value vaccination as incredibly important. As we've talked about this, it's come to my attention that my boyfriend was raised in a household that feared vaccination, only receiving those necessary to attend public school and idolize alternative medicine. I'm sad to watch how stressed it makes him to see how much his friends and coworkers disapprove of his choices. Despite understanding that common falsities like vaccines cause autism are just that, false, it seems like he still carries some irrational fear from his childhood. Although he's working on it, having honest and respectful conversations with me, coming with me to get my COVID booster, and reading pro-vaccine books, he's still very much controlled by the influence of his parents. I've expressed to him that it hurts me and worries me for conflicts in the future, like vaccinating potential children. I'm trying to balance encouraging him and giving him time to work through 25 years of conditioning, for lack of a better word, while also setting realistic boundaries and expectations for myself and coming to terms with the fact that if he isn't able or willing to work through this in a reasonable amount of time, this is a deal breaker for me. Any advice would be appreciated."
Why did you pick this one?
I picked it because I imagine that people are having these kinds of conversations and I think that they're having them to different extremes. I know of couples where everyone's vaccinated, but they have very different levels of comfortability in terms of what they're willing to go do in this COVID world. In another version of life, this issue between the two of them might not have come up until they were already married and had kids or, and we're trying to vaccinate the kids, or might not have ever been as blatant of a difference between them without this pandemic looming over all of us. But I also think it's so interesting because our listeners are so smart.
Yeah.
And like reading this, I was like, well, where's the room for advice? Because you're doing everything right.
I know.
And so that was also kind of interesting of like, even when we are taking a really balanced perspective on something, even when like what we're implementing is like what someone else might advise us to do, you can still feel like, I don't know what to do. Am I doing the right thing? If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also think, from his perspective, family conditioning is a lot. It is very, very hard to break out of. It is very, very hard when you're in a family system that operates a certain way and you choose to step outside the way that it operates. There's a risk that the system might fall apart. And so the people in the system close ranks around it. Something interesting that my therapist was talking to me about was because my parents have a little bit of a difficult time with Mal sometimes not because of Mal as a person, but because they want to have control. And then when I side with Mal on something, they're a little bit confused. And my therapist was saying, they think that it's not your decision, Gabby, because they make the decisions for you. And if they're not making the decision, then they don't think that you can, and they think someone else must be. So when you fail to fall into your place in the family system, they think you must be doing that somewhere else, which was really eye-opening for me. And so I think like for him, right, like if he wants to come to this conclusion on his own and go against everything that his nuclear family has taught him or done, it's really hard because there's a risk of being ostracized from what you know and being like seen now as like an outlier, an outsider, or someone who's against them rather than just someone who's like doing their own thing. And, with vaccination, it's become such a moral judgment. It's become such a thing of like, are you an ethical person or not? So if somebody gets vaccinated and you're not vaccinated, even if they're not saying so, it seems like they're saying I'm better than you. And like, for people who are anti-vax, I think it makes them defensive because it's like the media has and politicians and like, people who create like a binary political system, they've twisted it so that this like medical scientific thing is an indication of what side you're on. Which then it's like you siding against your family. So I understand that it's really hard. I also think there's a lot of fear involved in Western medicine. So, you talked about how he's really into alternative medicine. And I think there's a lot of fear mongering that has probably been ingrained in him about like there's chemicals in all this stuff and it's not natural and this is poison or whatever. And that's like really, really scary. I mean, putting anything in your body is scary. If you believe in the science, then it's like, you're still being like, well, I'll be sick for a couple days and then I'll be better and I'll be inoculated. But like, if you're in your mind being like, this is poison, this is like, not natural, this is my body could do this naturally or whatever, it's really hard to get over that anxiety. I don't know. It's interesting. I have a friend whose family is quite religious and she's had multiple family members pass away because they refuse modern medicine and they believe that Jesus will take care of them. To me, I would say, didn't God make people able to make medicine?
Oh, I never thought of it that way.
Am I crazy? Why would God make people able to make medicine if he didn't want you to take it?
I think it's really beautiful that you are understanding where he is coming from and that you're not letting this like very strict divide happen where
emotional and like
judgmental, and that you understand where he is coming from and that you understand why he is the way that he is and that the journey he's going through is tough and that you are seem to be acknowledging and grateful for the work that he is doing. And then I also think you're making the right decision in that we all have our own deal breakers. My deal breakers are different than your deal breakers, are different than Melissa's deal breakers, like and something that happens in relationships is you might not really know what your deal breaker is until it comes up. I think it is really kind of nice that you have the clarity that this is a deal breaker for you. And I think that that's valid and fine. We're all allowed to define our own deal breakers. I guess the murkiness now is that timeline, right? Of like, how much time are you willing to give him to get to where you're at with how you view the world and vaccines?
Well, also, have you asked him if his fear extends to children? It might just be that he's worried about himself, but like, this is the other thing, right? Is that the vaccines that have been available for children to go to school and, for all this kind of stuff, let's take COVID out of it. Those are, I mean, unless you're someone who's super anti-vaxxer who thinks that vaccines cause autism, which is also a whole nother thing because whatever, it's ableist. But if you're like, of course I would give my child the measles vaccine, like that's a vaccine that's been studied for years. Of course I would get a flu vaccine. That's a vaccine that we know, works and has been studied for years. My only fear is the COVID vaccine because it's so new. Like that's a different conversation, Well,
I think they said in the email that the family does what's necessary in order to go to school. And that's
what I'm saying for him, for children, like ask him where he's at with kids, that's might be different.
Yeah. It's really hard to be in a relationship with somebody who shares your values. Like, I know. Even if you are very similar, it's already really hard to be in a relationship. But then to be in a relationship where you have such different values or point of view about something that does impact your life in a big way. Just between